thank you very much. Apologies for the break in transmission, and we are back online. And I will back to you, Chuck. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Karina. So I'm going to talk about things which are a little bit similar to what Tracy said, but also totally different. I think we've ended up in a similar place from different coming in froms. That's not even a thing, is it? I'll give you a quick 1 minute on my background. I studied graphic art for 7 years, graduated in '92, and I chose to go to one of the only 2 universities in Britain that had a Quantel paint box, which was an early computer system that you could draw on the screen, which seems normal now, but was magic then. And then I started studios in central London around Soho and started making commercial art for corporations and other customers, using a lot of 3D technology, 3D drawing. And in about 2005, I quit that and moved down to Bristol and started using the same technology to make digital print and digital drawing for the gallery system. So effectively, the concept was to dump the client and start making imagery that would go out into the world without a brief attached to it. Effectively, make what you want to make and see if it floats. So I call the project Digital Drawing in a Material World, and what I'm really interested in, I suppose, is the hybridity between what's on system, what's material, and how those things can feed back between each other and kind of come off system into the real world and back again. In many ways, the system is the real world, of course, but I'll come with that. I've got a lot of pictures, so unlike Tracy, I'm going to go quite fast through a lot of pictures and maybe just kind of talk about the ones that grab my interest. So the first thing that really happened in 2005, I guess, is I came up with this realization as I was looking around craft shows and gallery shows around the world, that I was really excited by colour, light, line and form, probably more than painting and other kind of flat media. I feel as though some of these objects have more life in them, the way the light moves through them, and I thought it would be interesting from a printmaking perspective to see if I could capture some of the colour and life in glass for prints on the wall. This is a piece by Peter Layton. So these pieces, this is more Peter Layton, and this is Dale Chihuly. You can see here he's got this amazing kind of sculptural glass forms presented in, this is probably the Halcyon Gallery in London, and you can see that it's about colour and line and light. This is an early piece I drew called Flow. This is more Chihuly. This is exciting because it's got this yellow line, which he calls a lip wrap, which kind of delineates the space between the red and the blue and gives you this amazing kind of abstract line, which is a kind of painting thing brought into the 3D. So these are pieces I made. This is a piece on a customer's desk, and these are all early studies, and they take this idea of using kind of that colour and line and putting them onto flat panels for the wall. Yeah, this is the house in Bristol. Another view of that piece. I've become interested not only in drawing them sculpturally, so in other words in 3D on system, but also chopping the prints up in various different ways so that kind of emphasises the idea of the sculpture in the drawings themselves, and I find that to be quite an interesting extra dimension to the work. And this piece perhaps is a little bit more about inking and the way the ink moves through the system. I like digital serendipity, trying to make the system do things that it doesn't really want to do, slightly accidental mark making. Computers obviously run on maths, basically. And it's interesting to see if you can push them over the edge a little bit so they start misbehaving, and maybe you get something a little bit more random coming back out of the feedback out of the system. This is a full study called Arpeggi, which I made a few years ago, and I've got a lot of screenshots of this image, so I thought it was a nice one to talk about. This is a 48-panel poster print picture up on the wall in Paintworks in Bristol at a show called the Bristol Contemporary Open. So it's about 2.5 meters high. And I've got some slides here which just show you how I kind of sketch up, go on system and off system, work the shapes. This is a view of a 3D component. So arpeggi is a series of notes modulating in time, I guess. And for this, I wanted, therefore, to make a series of components for the picture, which would be the notes, and then hang them into a space. So I'm interested in the idea of the electronic music, the remix, the edit, and the way that you can push systems back and forwards in the same way that you can in a music studio. to create multiple mixes and edits of the material before it ultimately becomes printed out. So these are studies on the individual components, and this is a small print of one of the components. What's nice about this one, I think, is that I've used a low light in the middle, which means that the highlight on the edge really sings. It's the idea really of inverting the highlight, so there's a black patch in the middle of the object. These are grids which I'm printing out and drawing back onto, and these grids ultimately become the basis for the final study. I was interested here in the idea of having a smooth waveform on the left and a stepped waveform on the right, which in a sense is the way that the analog becomes digitized. Digital information is always stepped. And then looking at an asymmetric off-centered grid to lay the notes onto. And in its first iteration, I made it as a portfolio of 6 prints, which are simply red, yellow, and blue, and black, white, and grey. And they go into a gallery setting, something like that. They're also coming in a box, which was made with a company called G. Ryder & Co. Lovely company who made all of Stanley Kubrick's boxes. Apparently, he used to store his whole life in boxes in warehouses. So nice to work with them. The bigger studies, I'm going to run through these, are kind of colour studies. They're interested in line of light and the way that the ink, in a sense, is modulating through the forms, and the way that you can add detail on the digital system to make these prints which are quite liquid. I came up with the idea, or maybe I think I came up with it, whatever. Liquid geometry. I don't really like the idea of claiming ownership for any idea, actually. I think we're all in a lineage, and I think ideas are kind of in the water. So anyway, the idea is liquid geometry. So instead of making quite hard-edged things, I'm quite interested in making quite lyrical, soft, fluid marks. And these are some shots of the pieces in situ and in someone's home. This is a project space called Close House in Somerset. These studies kind of take on from that idea. This one's about the fluid mark making. The idea here is to have a fairly static center ground and then modulate the ink as it goes towards the top and the bottom. And this is it in gallery. This is a crop color. So one of the beautiful things about digital systems, of course, is that you can edit and crop and remix and recolor. And it allows you to do things, to kind of use the resources you've got and push them on a bit further. This one is called Lyric SV Systematic Variation, Tangerine Dream. Tangerine Dream, of course, are a synth band from the early 60s, German synth band, well worth listening to. The idea here was to remodulate the ink with an extra layer of rendering to make it more fluid and more liquid on the final prints. So you can see that the ink here is kind of being quite highly moved, and that's because it's effectively been re-rendered 3 times through various different filters that make it move and become more liquid. Massive Change is a book and project by Bruce Mao, and it's really talking about the idea of the world we're currently in, how it's designed, the digital, and the influence of digital in our current systems. And it's a really interesting thing to study. And I just got a few slides here which talk about how digital has influenced me from the 90s onwards, really. Digital typography, digital music, and the energy that's embodied in those kind of spaces. I'm really interested in energy in art and how that's embodied through the print, but also through your life. These are all seminal pieces, I think. This is Beer the Bang by Thomas Heatherwick. These are kind of digital products moving on from more analog processes that would have come earlier. And this is about wireframe rendering becoming products back in the space. So obviously I'm using wireframe rendering to create print, but I'm also observing it closely as it's used in the more sculptural spaces. This is Tony Cragg's work, where he's using 3D modeling to create sculpture. Like these are people's profile faces, face profiles, reiterated as CNC routed marble. This is Anthony Gormley using digital to look at the figure. Radio 1 is a piece where I wanted to explore the idea of removing the center from the print. When you remove the center, the energy that's in the middle of the picture is removed, and you have to look at the energy in a completely different way. So obviously this comes from a long line of people who've taken the middle out of something. This is an early Cornish standing stone. This is Barbara Hepworth. And there's an interest here in the idea of what happens to the energy of the drawing when you take the core out. These are early colour studies. And you can see here I'm building up the drawings, looking at the details. So it's the thing about kind of modular components, building up pieces as if you had like a sunflower head with multiple seeds in it, using tons of different components to kind of build up and study and really enjoy the micro as well as the big view. So looking at the individual components that are going to go into a piece. This is a study in abstraction. So you can see it in the middle. It's quite tightly linear, and towards the top edge, it becomes much more abstracted. And then it's about kind of looking at color and form and line and working out how this piece is going to be laid out and set up in such a way as to give a particular kick to the picture. So this picture is on a 120-degree rotational symmetry, and it gives it this kind of three-part energy as it travels around the disc. These are final color studies. This is the piece laser cut. So effectively what's happened here is I've output the print as a C-type metallic piece on Kodak Endura. I've mounted it onto the back of a piece of Perspex with an acrylic paste, and then it's been laser cut to the final shape. You can see it here in the gallery and in Collector's Home. So this is always interesting, I think, to see where the works end up and how people use them in their lives to kind of bring energy into their spaces. And I like this combination here of the man-made and the plant life, and we'll see a bit more of that later on. Fibonacci numbers. This is a mandala piece I drew a few years ago now. The Fibonacci numbers are basically you just add the two previous to get to the next one. And the Fibonacci spiral, when you draw it from these squares. So I'm really interested in maths and how computers deal with maths and how the maths generates form and how the form makes most of the stuff around us. And the Fibonacci numbers, of course, describe loads of interesting things. Sunflower heads, succulents, shape of your ear, the ratio of the bones in your body is what gets much more interesting. So your actual bones in your body are based on this number sequence. Breaking wave, the cosmos has the same number sequence that draws the arms of the galaxy that we're living in, the Milky Way. And I'm going to run through these quite fast, and you can just kind of see this drawing process and the finished mandala. And I'm interested, yeah, in a sense, in what the mandala form does for you in terms of just as a decorative object, but also as a spiritual object, how it talks historically. And I'm going to show you these two. These are tankers from Buddhist temples, and this is obviously about the geometry of the way they put their pictures together and the beauty and symbolism embodied in those. And I'm interested in studying that. So I suppose my practice here is about the idea of trying to teach myself about different aspects of the human condition, what we're all thinking about, and trying to embody that in the final pictures that I send out into the world as colour prints. And also what the digital can bring to the conversation, what you can kind of add, how you can move it on. Spectrum was a show in East London, bigger show, quite a nice show in a big space called the London Newcastle Project space. A couple of my pieces there. The one on the right is called Torsion, and it's a 3-panel piece that's really about growth. It's also worth noting here that this is Catherine Frederick's work here. And this big piece in the lobby space of the show is called Radial 2, which is the second piece I made, which is circular and has the centre cut out. And I thought it'd be nice to have a quick look at these slides. So you can see here that obviously I'm looking at natural forms, seashells, things I found on the beach, and I'm trying to kind of reinterpret those as contemporary digital print. And you can see here how these pieces work in a space. This is a workspace in London WGSN, who are colour forecasters. And they believe they can tell us what colours we're all going to be wearing in 3 years' time, which is quite an interesting thought all by itself. I've got a few more pieces here to show you that are all kind of riffing on similar ideas and taking the story forward a bit. This piece is called Lino Venetian, and really looks at the glass work of an amazing Italian maker called Lino Tagliapetra. R2, Radial 2, Helios Helianthos, is sunflower, and this is where I get more interested probably in the natural world around. So I've always been interested in, I'm a keen gardener, but I'm interested in the micro in the garden, planting seeds and getting into soil. And I think to start off with, it didn't really influence my practice very much, but it's become more obvious that these things are closely aligned, and I've become more interested in bringing it into the print work. These are sunflowers that I've grown, beautiful deep red ones, and this is a print that I've made. It's a 3-part print, so effectively there's a C-type photographic print that's coming up from the digital drawing. It's being laser cut and bonded into a foil back, which is also laser cut, and that then obviously gets, not obviously necessarily, gets cut a second time, debossed on a etching press, and ultimately ends up like this. So it's kind of 3 laser cuts, 2 materials and a piece of Somerset. So you get this kind of hybrid print, cut, laser, shape, sculptural object as print, which hopefully talks about the sun and growth. I just dropped this in to make this link that I do think we're all effectively in a line from deep history. This is a beautiful map of the cosmos. Some people think it's the first map of the cosmos from about 3,600 years ago. It was recently discovered in Germany. And I think it's sort of, I hadn't actually seen this when I made this, but I can't help but feel there's some serendipity between the objects I'm making there and things that people have made in the past, amazing things. Earthrise and the Event Horizon is about this idea of the Earth, seen here for the very first time from space, from Apollo 8 mission, which looked backwards from low moon orbit at our Earth and realised, I think for the first time we really realised how limited the Earth is, or unlimited, but also that it's a singular space that we need to have some respect for. I made this piece. Earthrise is obviously in the centre there, and then the cosmos is around it, and the cosmos takes the form here of a kind of artichoke heart, and there's some discussion or idea around the idea of a kind of calm central space and the chaos around us, which is also obviously therefore about your own personal life. This is in the collectome in Bristol. Again, it's laser cut. Having cut the hole, I became interested in the idea of filling the hole. So, and the language of the 2 different pieces, the hole still exists, but it's got something in it. I quite like that idea. There's a Japanese concept of ma, which is the idea of the negative space. The idea that everything's full and the, you know, what's in the space, what's not in the space, and how you look at it. There's a whole conversation to go around that. This piece is something in Cosmos 67, which is really about psychedelia in the 1960s when I was born, going to festivals, hanging out. The idea of the planet form inside the cosmos here as well, the green planet, night and day, yin and yang, a duality in the middle of a lot of chaos. So this is where I've been thinking more recently. The studio is a place for study and research, geolocated at a specific moment in time. And that's really the idea that we are where we are now, and that you can only make work that speaks to the moment. You can't really get too stuck in the past. You have to really work around where you are and look at what's available to you today. These are shots of my garden. And on one day in May, during lockdown, I went out and photographed everything that was in bloom on that day and just made this really simple hexagon-based piece, which is obviously the language of the honeycomb and the bee, what I'd grown, and just kind of recorded it and made it as a piece. I actually have a print club where I send out pieces 4 times a year to people who subscribe to the club, and I send them small works on paper, and we have a kind of long-running dialogue over the 6 or 7 years now. Some of the people have been in since edition 1. We're up to edition 26, I think. So it's really nice to have this long-running conversation with people about my life, their life, and the continuum through these small objects that are being made and posted out. And I do like the idea of increasingly making quite small ephemeral things which don't use too much material. And effectively it supplies them with a very small income because they pay a monthly subscription to be members of the club, which kind of funds the studio just about. This is a tulip I've grown, and this print is obviously speaking the language of that. So these tulips are called viridiflora, and they have this beautiful parity style. And I'm interested in using that and seeing how that can be converted into ink on paper. And this is a similar version, a variation, talking more about water and fire. This piece is called Elemental, and it's obviously about the energy in a waveform. And this is a more recent study called Sennen, which is about the landscape. This is Sennen Cove in Cornwall, somewhere I've been quite a lot. And the idea of trying to abstract some of that landscape into a colour print for the wall. And again, a very light ephemeral product, just, you know, 1 piece of ink on 1 piece of paper. Of course, this piece is called Revox, and it's about motion and light and colour and the way that liquids can move in a space. This is it as a black and white etching. So that's really just 1 alpha channel in Photoshop reimagined as an etching. And this is it in gallery. There's fantastic work of Anna Gillespie, who works with natural materials, especially beech nuts. I wanted to just quickly look at wireframes and what's exciting about them. This is the work of Nam Gabo, portrait that you can see in Tate, and one of his prints. He was working in the 20s, really, so I mean, I just show you these because they're super influential on someone who was way ahead of his time. And then more recently, the work of Zaha Hadid, who's used the same kind of wireframe technology to create these architectural spaces and sculptures. And this is Andrew Gursky, who's used it for his photography. And it's all about the idea of working in space, using computers to create form in a way that we haven't been able to do before. This is obviously the human figure again. This is Thomas Saraceno. And looking at how you can use wireframe to break up a space and explore line and motion and colour and geometry. This is Buckminster Fuller, 1967, really early adopter of the idea of the wireframe and using it to delineate a space. Eden, Peter Randall Page, and these beautiful seed pod sculptures which are sitting at Eden. Cradle 3 is a project that I've drawn. It's a bigger disc with central cutout, and it's really trying to assimilate things like pupae, chrysalis, and sweet peas that I'm growing in my garden. So I'll just show you back at the original photo here. You can kind of see the chrysalis forms and the kind of sweet pea colours. So I like the idea of working with what's growing in the garden in the studio. The studio looks at the garden and the garden looks at the studio. So it's about growing things in nature and trying to get that back into the print work. And I'm going to run through these slides, and you can see here how the mass is being used to generate pattern and form, fluid marks, fluid lines, fast-moving lines, lyrical progressions. So this piece actually has 24 frames of animation in it. So I'll show you the golfers and show how that works, and they're composited back into the final piece. And you can see from these slides how I'm experimenting with colour and line and looking for solutions, pulling out etchings along the way from particular alpha masks, positive and negative spaces. This would have gone out to print club members. So it's nice to have these small ephemeral pieces that come off the side of the main body of work and go out into the world, hopefully never to return, to people who are interested in the project. These are colour studies, very interested in colour. I don't talk much about colour, I think colour is more innate in a way. These are nearly finished colour studies which I've ultimately rejected along the way in favour of two colour variants which I finished with. This one is called Pearlescent and it's about those summer colours, and this one's called Candy Black and it's more about glass and those bright colours you get in glasswork. And here you can see the kind of nature of the highlights and the lowlights and the way they can punch a colour up. And I'm using papers which kick a lot of light back into the room, and the Perspex, which also does the same. So you get these quite vivid prints which bring a lot of colour and light and energy into the spaces that they inhabit. Print is more about geometry and also glass and colour studies and the way that you can mess around with things on a computer to chop them up and cut them about, which obviously I enjoy greatly. I'm going to run through these really fast. Stellify is about origami and maths. This is the 14th installation of an icosahedron. I built this model out of 60 pieces of paper. It's got 5 colours. None of the colours touch, and it makes a really beautiful paper basis for a series of digital progressions. I've made full progressions on it since I made the model. And these pieces really look at the geometry. So the geometry has been digitized, and then obviously it gives you the basis for looking at color study and form and print. So these are sort of more exploded views, I guess, pushed around. This is a print club print. This is a print club print as well. So this is Stellify 4, the most recent iteration, where I decided to look at something a bit more minimal. So there's a kind of interest in the maximal and an interest in the minimal. So this is just 4 of the components laid out on a piece of metallic paper. And these are bigger studies, effectively using the geometry as landscape. So you feel as though you're inside some kind of paper-based landscape form, and really enjoying looking at the way that the colours and panels can be put together for bigger works on paper. Folded works, I'm interested in freestanding works which kind of speak some of the language of sculpture as well as print. So this, again, this is a print club edition that's gone out to people in the post. And then obviously bigger pieces for the wall. So this is the work I've been doing at CFPR. I've only really just started, and I'll show you what I've got so far. I've been interested in the idea of the seed pod, which won't surprise you. So the miniature, and I'm also interested in the idea of the bigger form as well. So I started out making some really simple CGI drawings of the seed pod, and realizing that then in a PLA 3D printed model, which is the first time I've actually printed something in 3D, which is kind of funny because I've been drawing in 3D for 20 or more years and never actually printed a 3D model. But that's been fascinating to actually be able to put it in your hand. So there's something quite tangible about that. So I made these two basic primitives. They're exactly the same mass, interestingly, so they have the same volume, but one is spun and seems bigger. The other is straight up and more like a Brancusi piece. These are then set up with the amazing help of Angela's weights at the centre, and we cast these objects into glass, which effectively means that the plastics were burnt out of the moulds, and the moulds were then used to pour glass into, poured in the sense of it being very hot and going down into moulds. So I ended up with these test objects. These are really just test objects for a bigger piece, but it's a really interesting first exploration into the idea of creating something from the digital drawing as a handleable glass object. Expanding the form is the idea of really just looking at the seeds and how these drawings can possibly be expanded into bigger, more expansive ideas about form. This piece here, I think, I'm hoping to use again with a more brush-like stroke, but I think there's an etching in here somewhere. Not as crude as this, but hopefully I think there's some magic here that maybe can be made into something quite interesting. So effectively the shapes are being expanded up into space and they become a bit bigger. Angela told me this idea, the mini monumental, which I really like. It's her idea of making very small things in this moment where we need to be maybe more cautious of using materials and enjoying the miniature rather than making enormous things. And I'm interested in certainly thinking about that and continuing to think about that. And I'm interested in some quite basic primitives, but I'm also interested in the idea of the tower structure here in the wire form, where the tower can be quite small. So these are just random sketches that I've been working on for the last week or so. These are literally off my system the last couple of days. And I'm interested here in the Tower. This is the Tower of Babel, or one version of it. It's an engraving of the Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel, of course, is attached to the Hanging Gardens at Babylon. So it's an early iteration of the idea of a structure and the garden combined to make this kind of fabled, possibly real, possibly not real place that we can maybe exist in now. The idea of the garden, the space, and kind of looking after plant life in our own systems and ways of being. This is the Tatlin Tower, and I dropped this in partly because it's a wire form, and partly because it clearly speaks to the idea of the Tower of Babel, which I hadn't really noticed before this week, that these two really famous towers are almost coming from the same place. So I'm interested in the idea of building up the idea of a tower structure around the seed pod, or at least that's my initial thinking, or my current thinking. And I've been kind of modelling up some basic primitives, which you can see here. These are just unrendered math models to see how these forms might come together and how they might speak to the idea of the seed pod. So the maths here is key. You can see here the beauty of the simple two curved forms and how you can bisect those with these kind of 30-degree isometric lines, which in itself gives you these kind of units that can be cast into glass, perhaps, or another material, could be ceramic, and how those individual components can be used to build up into a bigger tower. So effectively taking lots of small modular components to build something bigger, which comes back to what I've been doing in a lot of the print work over recent years. So here you're seeing how this model can be sculpted, built up, and kind of possibly built out of multiple smaller parts. So this is 4 pieces on the left-hand side and how they kind of step around, a bit like the arpeggio folio. These are a series of planar studies for how the object can be bisected. Interestingly, on the math, if you start spinning things around, you have to have bisection planes which speak to both components simultaneously and work for both components. And you can end up maybe with something, perhaps something like this. Possibly with a central core as well. So I'm currently thinking about the idea of dropping a central core into a series of external components to make a single sculptural object in which maybe 9 or 10 components come together. I think the external components will be clear and the inner core will probably be the color of the sun. So there's a kind of internal energy and then a refraction of color through the clear forms, which might give quite a beautiful object, possibly something like this. Boom. Thank you. my final slide is this, and this is Olaf Eliasson's piece in the Turbine Hall. And if you went there, you already know that was something quite amazing, where effectively he captured a man-made version or person-made version of the sun inside the space and shared that energy with a lot of people over a lot of months. And it was a pretty fantastic place to be.
Thank you, Chuck.
You're welcome.
From macro to micro, from flowers to cosmos, I think you've covered a lot in that in those 40 minutes. Has anyone got any questions? I'm going to pass to the back first, because there was a momentary.
Hi, thanks for that. That was really great. I'm really interested in what seems to have been either an increase in appreciation of nature or an increase in people's connection to nature since the sort of enforced separation from it because of the lockdowns. Do you think that is what sort of spurred your interest in pursuing the natural form part, or whether it was sort of that was what was there, so that's what you focused on? Or?
Thank you for the question. In fact, I was a member of the first green screen printing cooperative in the UK back in 1986. I think we were the first people in the UK to print with organic inks and all of that stuff. What is happening, I think, is I used to keep my kind of politics and my interest in environmentalism, which is lifelong really, in one silo, and my kind of commercial art practice in a second silo. And I used to run commercial studios in Soho, so I'd be out on eco-protest, locking myself onto some plane or something on a weekend, and then going back into Soho and making corporate products for people to sell their wares. And by about 2005, I decided I couldn't really continue with that. So it goes back a lot further for me. And I think what I'm trying to do now is reconcile the difficulty of using material to make objects with a desire to continue making, obviously, and have a voice and have some kind of space in the world. And yeah, the reality that we need to be really cautious about how much energy and how much material we're using. But for me, it goes right back to, I would map it back to 1986. Marvin Gaye was singing about it in 1967. And Barbara Papa was concerned about it in 1973. I make those 2 points because I used to read Barbara Papa when I was about 6. And if you read his books, you can see that concern is right there. I've read them to my kids more recently, and it's quite interesting to see that all of those concerns have really been there for a really long time. But I don't think we've been listening to them quite loudly enough.
Okay, thank you.
So this is a question about authorship.
Right.
So when we had our girls' night out, we had a really heated discussion about artificial intelligence and what the outcome, who is the author. So you are standing on the shoulders of giants because you are not writing the code. You use the code done by or written by other people. So you said that you try to push the code to do something unexpected.
So not the code, actually the drawing.
The drawing.
I don't.
But it's what do you mean? I mean.
So these are not. I'm not using code to generate the drawings. I'm using a GUI, a graphical user interface. So I'm drawing.
Yes, but you via this interface, you try to push the code to get it into a glitch, or did I misunderstand?
No, you're right. So that's not really what I'm. Yes and no. I'm not under the bonnet messing with the code. I am, as you say, using the tools which are provided to me by the software developers in the same way that you would use an etching press or a pencil that's been provided to you by amazing people who make the etching press, in my mind.
Okay.
But nevertheless, so the glitches I'm looking for are through the process of drawing and rendering and lighting. So I'm looking for serendipitous byproducts of, so in the maths, in the way the maths builds the images, but also, so what I do, this is, again, not really particularly my idea. The idea here is how to get a kind of jazzy live feel into the final print, right? And computers are really slow at processing. So what the idea is, and it's an idea that I certainly came across with Tom York from Radiohead, talks about the idea of pre-formatting everything that you're going to use before you get to the session. So effectively, I'll spend 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks generating maybe 6, 7, 8 different drawings, create maybe 60 or 100 different images. And then once they're all kind of ready to go, so that's quite a slow and not tedious, it's interesting, but it's a slow process. But then hopefully what happens is you gather all that material together for a single day of making, and you kind of smash it together really fast because they're all pre-formed components at that point. And it's in that moment that you can maybe, you'd kind of have to come and watch me working in a way. I will just smash those things together quite brutally with a lot of loud music on and not worry too much about how they're going to fit. And if things then come apart at that moment, that's where those kind of little interlaps or unexpected things, you might sort of double load a mask, kick it back over so that you're working with a negative space and then paste something through that you weren't expecting to see. It's not really about coding under the bonnet. Other people do that, and that's always amazing, but that's not been my interest.
So when you smash it together, and then I give
Yeah.
I mean.
Yeah. So
that is basic the one-off of
yeah,
the
that's the one-off
artwork.
moment. That's the live performance. In that, I loathe to use the word performance, but in that sense, you are then using those components and bringing together in the same way that if you're playing a musical instrument, it would be and that's then really into the idea of 10,000 hours. That I've been sitting on system now for 30 years, and I can go really fast in those kind of sessions, and I have ideas about how to push outwards a little bit to get more color, more tone, more energy into the drawings.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the talk. I've noticed some of your works in a couple different settings, such as schools, galleries, houses, and office spaces.
Right.
How do you feel about the work being the context of the work being transformed in different spaces, or you're agreeing with what Oliver said, sharing the energy of the work?
Yeah, I'm always really flattered when people actually buy a piece for their own home, so that's just fantastic. The office spaces, pretty happy with that as well. If people see them when they're at work, I think that's fine. I mean, ultimately, I think there's the interest for me is in making the work. I've got relatively less interest in where the final pieces end up. I'm working in a largely commercial sector, so most of my pieces go out to UK galleries or global galleries occasionally, and those galleries then sell them on to their end collectors. And obviously those collectors have an interest in collecting the piece for whatever interest they have, whether it's a one-off or whether they've got a bigger collection. My interest is more in the study and the making. But effectively the sales fund the studio, and the studio needs to create enough wealth to continue moving forward in a small way. So effectively, I suppose, I show you the context of the work because I think it's interesting to see where the objects end up. They're free of me at that point, and they have to live out in the world on their own terms. It is really nice to get positive feedback from people who really respond well to the work and do choose to have it in their own homes. And I think there has to be some celebration of that. I personally, as I've already said, I'm a little bit reluctant to use a lot of material, shipping a lot of work around, and I think there's a problem with that. But I haven't resolved beyond the idea of just reducing the amount you're using, just trying to get onto just paper, unframed paperworks that just go in the world that way. The minute things get framed and shipped, it all gets a bit more heavy.
Right, thank you.
Hello. So you said you're very into energy.
Right.
How do you translate the energy you understand into your visual form, and how do you hold on to that energy, whatever that may be?
Can you ask the first question again? Sorry, the first part.
How do you translate?
How do I translate it?
How do you translate the energy you understand into your visual form? I know you've got a lot of process to it, but how do you hold on to that to be able to come out with a finished result?
I don't know. I think we all have a certain amount of energy each day, and I just try and focus it in on my work. I think there's a lot of energy to be gained from walking around in the world, getting into the sun, feeling the sun on your skin, and just trying to bring that energy and positivity into the studio and make the best work you can. Yeah, I mean, we ultimately will have a limited amount of energy from birth to death, don't we? And it's a question of what you're going to do with the amount that's been allotted to you. And some long time ago, I decided I was going to make digital print. Yeah, and you know, it's really about trying to embody that energy. I think debatably, where the art exists is between the viewer and the object, right? you put an object on the wall or in a space and someone comes to view it or live with it over a period of time. It's interesting, the living in the home thing, because of course when you live with something in the home you have a much longer relationship with it than if you just encounter it in a gallery one afternoon. So those are two different settings. But ultimately, if you are two people standing in front of one art object and you talk about it later, you'll probably both have got something quite different from it, even though you're in the same moment of time. And it's the same object in the same space. So the only thing that's different is you and your thoughts about it. And I think in a way, a bit like the negative space, the mask space, there's a space between you and the art object, and that is debatably where the art happens and where the energy is. The object is obviously giving off colour and light and form, and you're kind of absorbing your thoughts about it. But depending on what's happened to you that day, or that week, or that month, or that lifetime, will depend on how you respond to the work. And obviously that will determine which works you're more interested in engaging with and which ones you're going to walk past, because you can't engage with everything. So you have to kind of choose where, you know, your interest lies. So yeah, it's interesting to see the work in the world and see how people respond to it. But ultimately, you don't get to do very much of that because, of course, you're generally not in those conversations in those moments. Those tend to happen between the gallerist and the collector while you're absent. Having said that, you see, so my print club does give me a much bigger feedback with people over the longer term, and we have conversations, sometimes meet up and get these nice email conversations going, which is much more interesting then, because instead of being focused on the object, you become interested in the longer conversation over a period of time. Debatably, art is an arc, a linear arc of your life traveling through time, making these objects, and the objects are kind of points on the curve, points on the vector curve, but the art is the full journey, not the individual objects.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? I've just got quite a nice observation about the way that you go about collecting and inspiring. So the first sort of pictures of the chihulis
Right.
and the glass and
Yeah.
the little line, and how you absorb all that, which is then synthesized into your work.
Yeah.
Do you do that in order to sort of create a body of work?
No, I just do that because I'm interested in it. Yeah, I mean, I try and get out as much as possible and see as much as possible in nature and in the gallery. So, you know, I went to a Woolwich Contemporary Print Open this autumn, which was fantastic. If you haven't been to that, definitely go. But yeah, just walking in the world and seeing what's being made. Mm-hmm. Yeah, product design, architecture.
So absorbing all sorts of different, things.
Distilling it into ideas for form and colour. Yeah, mm-hmm. It's a subconscious process, probably, I think. But do you put it anywhere, or is it, as you say, is it just a collection of in your head, or do you have a scrapbook of visual data? I have a digital scrapbook, and I have a couple of workrooms absolutely packed with stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm glad you got the packed full of stuff.
Yeah, too much stuff. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Chuck? No? Any other online questions? No? Okay, great. Thank you. So please join me in thanking Chuck for a fantastic talk.